Henrietta turned the brown paper package over once more, her fingers tracing the rough twine that bound it with the methodical precision she applied to every task in life. The paper bore no postmark, no indication that it had traveled through the ordinary channels of delivery. It simply existed, as if it had materialized on the grass beneath the gift table through some act of will rather than physical conveyance. She looked up from the parcel, scanning the assembled crowd with an expression that suggested she was searching for some sign of explanation, some guilty face or hastily averted gaze that might betray the package's origin. The afternoon sun caught the silver threads in her hair, and for a moment she appeared almost as a figure from another era, a woman caught between the modern disorder of the fitty and some older, more formal world where such mysteries were addressed through proper channels and established protocols. Her companion, Miss Dorothy Hartley, who had been standing beside the gift table arranging the raffle tickets into neat piles, noticed the sudden shift in Henrietta's demeanor and moved closer with the intimate knowledge of someone who had served as companion to the same woman for the past 12 years. "Is something the matter, Miss Ashford?" Dorothy asked, her voice carrying that particular note of gentle concern mixed with professional discretion that characterized her interactions with her employer. Dorothy was a woman of approximately 60 years, with the sort of indefinable appearance that comes from a lifetime of making oneself useful and unobtrusive. Her gray dress was sensible, her cardigan practical, and her expression perpetually arranged in an attitude of helpful attentiveness. She had come to Henrietta's employ after her own widowhood had left her in reduced circumstances, and over the intervening years had become something more complex than merely an employee, neither quite family nor quite servant, but rather that peculiar hybrid creature that flourishes in English village life. "No, nothing the matter," Henrietta replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Only that this parcel has appeared rather mysteriously. I do not recall anyone delivering it, and it bears no label whatsoever." One would think, Dorothy, that in this day and age, someone would have the courtesy to identify the origin of a gift, particularly when said gift has been placed upon a table holding items of considerable value. She held the package at arm's length, regarding it with the expression one might direct toward a potentially contaminated object. "I cannot imagine who might have brought it, or why they would have done so without explanation or acknowledgement." Miss Jane Marple, who had excused herself from her conversation with the vicar's wife and had drifted closer to the gift table with the sort of apparently aimless movement that characterized her social interactions, offered a gentle observation. Miss Marple was a woman of indeterminate age. She might have been anywhere from 60 to 80, though the village had long since ceased to speculate on such specifics, with white hair arranged in neat waves and eyes of a remarkably clear blue that seemed to notice rather more than they should. She wore a cardigan of faded pink wool and a sensible skirt, and carried a small handbag from which she would occasionally produce a ball of knitting wool, as if the very act of creating something orderly and useful was necessary to her continued existence. "How very curious," Miss Marple remarked, moving closer with the casual proximity of someone who was simply gravitating naturally toward conversation, rather than inserting herself deliberately into the situation. "You know, something very similar occurred at the village fefty 3 years ago, or was it 4, when the Reverend Thornton received that rather mysterious donation for the church roof. It turned out to have been sent by a cousin in Australia, who had not realized the postal service might prove unreliable. One would be astonished at how often these apparent mysteries resolve themselves into the most ordinary explanations." She tilted her head slightly, observing the package with the mild interest one might direct toward a crossword puzzle. "Though this does seem rather recent in its delivery, does it not? The paper is quite fresh, not at all weathered or creased from travel." Henrietta's expression flickered with something that might have been irritation at the implication that her gift table might have been the subject of careless handling. "I assure you, Miss Marple, that I have been supervising this table throughout the afternoon, No one has approached it without my knowledge, save for those adding their contributions to the raffle." She paused, reconsidering her statement with the honesty that characterized her better moments. "Though, I confess, I did step away for approximately 5 minutes when the music began to speak with Lord Berkshire regarding the clock tower restoration. It was during that interval, I should think, that this mysterious package appeared." Dorothy leaned forward, peering at the parcel with renewed interest. "Perhaps you should open it now, Miss Ashford, before the prize draw commences. It would be rather awkward to discover later that it was something requiring immediate attention." Her practical suggestion hung in the warm afternoon air, and Henrietta appeared to consider it with the gravity one might apply to a significant decision. Around them, the fay continued its ordinary rhythms. Children shrieked with delight at the games. The brass band struck up another medley. The vicar cheerfully announced the winner of the baking competition to modest applause. Yet in that small circle around the gift table, an almost imperceptible tension had settled. Though none of the 3 women could have articulated precisely why, they felt a sudden sense that something had shifted, that some invisible equilibrium had tilted in a direction that would prove irreversible. Henrietta regarded the modest brown parcel once more, her fingers working methodically at the knot that secured the twine. The paper crackled beneath her touch, that particular sound of stiff wrapping that suggested the package had been assembled with care rather than hurried indifference. Miss Marple watched the proceedings with an expression of mild interest, though her eyes tracked every movement with a precision that belied the apparent casualness of her observation. Around them, the Feffy continued its cheerful obliviousness to this small drama unfolding at the gift table, though a few of the closer observers had begun to notice that something unusual was occurring. Mrs. Constance Webb, the postmistress, had paused in her examination of the knitted goods to direct a questioning gaze toward the little group, her sharp eyes narrowing with that particular intensity that came from years of managing village correspondence and its attendant gossip. Young Timothy Blackwell, still presiding over the Rings for Bottles game, had also shifted his attention momentarily, though his professional obligations soon reclaimed him. The wrapping fell away to reveal a box of cream-colored cardboard, the sort that might have contained chocolates or fine biscuits. Henrietta lifted the lid with the careful deliberation of someone handling an archaeological artifact, and the assembled witnesses, for by now Miss Marple and Dorothy had been definitively joined in their attention by several curious onlookers, leaned forward to discern its contents. Within the box lay a single item, a silver locket, old but well-maintained, its surface polished to a soft gleam that suggested regular care. The locket was suspended from a thin silver chain, and inscribed on its surface was a date, 1952. Nothing else. No initial, no dedication, no name. Merely that single year, rendered in elegant copperplate lettering that suggested professional engraving. The silence that followed this revelation was not particularly dramatic. No gasps, no exclamations of surprise. Instead, it was the peculiar quiet that falls when multiple people simultaneously arrive at the recognition that something significant has occurred, though none of them could articulate precisely why. Henrietta's face had gone very still, all color seeming to drain from her cheeks, in a manner that would have been alarming had anyone been in a position to notice such details with proper attention. Her fingers trembled almost imperceptibly as she held the locket, and her breath appeared to catch in her throat, though whether from shock, recognition, or some other emotion was impossible to determine from external observation alone. "How very strange," Miss Marple observed mildly, her tone suggesting nothing more than polite curiosity about a minor oddity. A locket with only a date. Not a birthday or anniversary marker, one would think, but rather something of a different significance entirely. Though I confess I cannot imagine what message the giver intended to convey by such a cryptic offering. One might wonder whether the sender expected the recipient to understand the reference, or whether they intended the mystery to be part of the gift itself. Dorothy reached out tentatively, her hand hovering near Henrietta's arm in that gesture of subordinate concern that had become habitual between them. "Miss Ashford? Are you quite well? You've gone rather pale. Perhaps we should retire to the pavilion for a moment. I could fetch you some lemonade from the refreshment tent." Henrietta did not respond immediately. She continued to stare at the locket, turning it slowly in her palm, examining it from every angle as if some new detail might suddenly materialize from its familiar surface. Her lips moved slightly, as though she was speaking to herself, conducting some internal conversation that no one else was permitted to hear. When she finally looked up, her expression had assumed that mask of controlled composure that was so characteristic of her, the sort of expression that suggested she had encountered something unexpected, but was determined not to allow it to disrupt the ordinary proceedings of the afternoon. "I see," she said quietly, though the words seemed directed toward some audience invisible to the others present. "Yes, I see perfectly well what this means." She turned to Dorothy with an expression that was difficult to interpret, not quite anger, not quite distress, but rather something more complex that involved elements of resignation and a peculiar species of confirmation. "We shall discuss this privately, Dorothy. For now, I believe we should continue with the prize draw as scheduled. There is no need to allow this small mystery to disrupt the afternoon's activities." She closed the locket firmly in her hand and slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan with a decisive gesture. The crowd, sensing that whatever interesting moment had been unfolding was now concluded, began to disperse back toward their various entertainments. The brass band launched into another enthusiastic, if somewhat discordant rendition of a popular tune. Children resumed their pursuit of coconut shies and ring-toss games with renewed vigor. Yet Miss Marple remained motionless for a moment longer, her blue eyes fixed on Henrietta's retreating figure with an expression of profound thoughtfulness. She had spent 70-odd years observing the small dramas of village life, and she possessed an almost intuitive understanding of when something that appeared trivial was in fact the opening chapter of something far more significant. The locket, with its mysterious date and anonymous donor, represented the sort of thing that, in her long experience, rarely remained a simple puzzle. It was, instead, the kind of object that carried weight, that held within its small metallic confines the potential for considerable disruption to whatever peace the village might have been enjoying. By the time the prize draw had concluded, with Mrs. Margaret Sinclair from the cottage near the railway station winning the silver salver and accepting it with considerably less grace than Henrietta might have preferred, the afternoon had begun its gradual transition toward evening. The sun hung lower on the horizon, casting longer shadows across the meadow, and a slight chill had entered the air. That particular English summer coolness that arrives without warning and necessitates the retrieval of abandoned cardigans and lightweight wraps. The crowd had begun its slow dispersal, families gathering children and folding chairs, the volunteer workers commencing the familiar ritual of dismantling the temporary structures that had transformed the meadow into a festive space. The brass band, mercifully, had packed away their instruments and departed in the direction of Millbrook, leaving the afternoon to a more natural soundtrack of birdsong and distant traffic. Henrietta had performed her duties as patroness with her customary precision, presenting prizes with gracious words, thanking volunteers with evident sincerity, and maintaining throughout the proceedings that air of benevolent authority that seemed to settle over any gathering she attended. Yet those who knew her well, and Miss Marple was beginning to recognize that she did indeed know Henrietta rather better than most casual acquaintances would have presumed, noticed that something fundamental had shifted in her demeanor. Her smiles, while present, lacked their usual warmth. Her words of thanks, though properly spoken, seemed to emerge from some distance, as though her mind was occupied elsewhere, attending to some internal matter of considerably greater significance than the immediate social requirements before her. Dorothy remained constantly at Henrietta's side, as she had for 12 years, though her usual expression of capable helpfulness had been replaced by something more akin to concern mixed with barely suppressed curiosity. When Henrietta finally declared that they would depart for home, citing the fatigue that came inevitably after an afternoon of social exertion, Dorothy moved with more haste than usual, gathering their belongings and settling Henrietta into the car with the solicitude of someone tending to a patient rather than an employer. Miss Marple, observing this interaction from her position near the refreshment tent where she had been assisting Mrs. Helen Thornton with the final arrangements of cups and saucers, made a small mental note of the exchange. She had learned, over her many years, that the small deviations from established patterns of behavior often proved more informative than the dramatic gestures that initially caught one's attention. As Henrietta's motor car departed down the lane toward her residence, a substantial Victorian property known as Ashford House, situated on the outskirts of the village, Miss Marple found herself approached by Mrs. Constance Webb, the postmistress, who seemed to have been waiting for an opportune moment to engineer a conversation. Constance was a woman of approximately 55 years, with sharp features and sharper eyes, the sort of person whose profession seemed to have been specifically designed to accommodate her natural inclinations toward information gathering and analysis. She had managed the village post office for the past 20 years, and in that capacity had become, almost by necessity, the repository of an extraordinary quantity of knowledge regarding the personal affairs of every resident within a 10-mile radius. Rather extraordinary business with Miss Ashford and that mysterious parcel, Constance remarked, keeping her voice pitched at that level of apparent casualness that fooled no one who knew her well. One does wonder where it came from. No postage, no markings, simply appearing beneath the gift table as if by magic. Most irregular. I should mention, Miss Marple, that Miss Ashford has been receiving rather more correspondence than usual over the past few weeks. Nothing remarkable in itself, but there was a particular envelope that arrived last month, cream-colored, rather expensive paper, the sort one might expect to contain a personal letter from someone of considerable standing. She seemed quite affected when she received it, though she said nothing to explain the contents. Miss Marple, who had been folding a damask tablecloth with methodical precision, paused in her work and turned to regard Constance with an expression of mild interest that disguised the intensity of her attention. "How very interesting," she observed quietly. "One does wonder whether such matters are generally connected, or whether they represent merely the ordinary complications of village life. Though I confess that I have always found that when an apparently isolated incident occurs, it frequently proves to be part of some larger pattern that only becomes apparent once all the pieces have had the opportunity to reveal themselves." Constance leaned closer, her voice dropping to a more confidential register. "There is something else, Miss Marple, something that perhaps bears mentioning. About 3 months ago, there was a rather significant commotion at Ashford House. I do not know the specifics, you understand, but my sister's daughter works as a cleaner there, and she mentioned that Miss Ashford had dismissed a young woman who had been employed as her secretary. The girl left quite suddenly, and Miss Ashford would not discuss the circumstances with anyone. There was gossip, of course, there always is, but nothing was ever confirmed. I merely mention it because it occurred to me that such matters sometimes resurface in unexpected ways." Miss Marple resumed her folding with renewed attention, though her mind was clearly occupied with something beyond the immediate task. "How remarkably illuminating," she said softly. "These small pieces of information, when assembled correctly, often reveal patterns that would otherwise remain hidden. One might almost say, Mrs. Webb, that you have provided me with the foundation for a most interesting puzzle indeed. The village of St. Giles settled into evening with that particular quality of English twilight that seems to extend indefinitely. never quite committing to full darkness, but rather maintaining a prolonged state of shadowed illumination. Miss Marple had returned to her cottage, a modest property situated on the village green, with a small garden that occupied most of her attention and provided her with considerably more satisfaction than she would have admitted to most acquaintances, and had settled herself in the comfortable chair positioned near the front window with a cup of tea and her knitting. The rhythmic motion of needles and yarn provided her with a useful accompaniment to thought, a physical occupation that allowed her mind to roam freely across the various observations she had accumulated throughout the afternoon. The locket with its cryptic date, the mysterious disappearance of Henrietta's secretary, the correspondence from 3 months prior, and most significantly, the particular manner in which Henrietta had reacted to the discovery of the package, all of these elements seemed to exist in some relationship to one another, though the precise configuration remained unclear. By the following morning, the events of the previous day had begun their inevitable transformation into village gossip, that peculiar process by which fact is gradually transmuted into speculation and speculation into accepted narrative. The tale of the mysterious locket had been reported to no fewer than 30 people by the time the post office opened at 9 o'clock, and by mid-morning the basic facts had been supplemented with numerous embellishments that bore little relationship to what had actually occurred. According to one account, the locket had contained a photograph of a handsome stranger. According to another, it was some sort of coded message from a foreign government. A third version suggested that it was a lover's token from some long-forgotten romance that Henrietta had been forced to conceal due to propriety. The truth, which was considerably less dramatic than any of these elaborations, seemed to hold little appeal for those engaged in the pleasant pursuit of speculation. Miss Marple became aware of these various theories through the ordinary channels of village communication. A conversation with the grocer's wife while purchasing vegetables, a remark from the vicar's wife during a meeting of the Women's Institute, and most informatively, a lengthy discussion with young Timothy Blackwell, who had encountered her near the library and seemed inclined toward candid conversation. Timothy was a pleasant young man of approximately 28 years, intelligent and observant in ways that suggested he did not belong entirely to the village, but rather maintained some connection to a larger world beyond its boundaries. He worked at the chemist's shop operated by Mr. Reginald Blackwell, his uncle, and lived in modest rooms above the premises. He seemed to possess that particular quality of youth that inclines one toward honesty, when discretion might be more advisable. The thing that struck me as odd, Timothy mentioned as they walked together toward the village square, was the timing of it all. You see, just last week, I happened to encounter Miss Ashford in the shop, and she seemed rather distressed about something. My uncle had to compound a fairly strong sedative for her, something to aid sleep, he said. At the time, I thought perhaps it was simply the ordinary troubles of age, but given what happened at the fête day, I wonder whether something more significant was troubling her. Miss Marple listened with that particular quality of attention that made people feel as though their words were being received and processed by someone genuinely interested in their meaning rather than merely their surface content. "How very observant of you, Mr. Blackwell," she remarked gently. "One does find that people's behavior often reveals far more than they themselves realize they are communicating." A request for a sedative, combined with the appearance of a mysterious locket, might suggest that Miss Ashford had been anticipating some form of disturbance to her peace of mind. The question becomes, of course, whether she expected the locket itself, or whether she had some other matter weighing upon her consciousness. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a visitor, a visit that appeared unannounced and somewhat unexpected, though she received her caller with the courtesy that characterized her interactions with all of the village residents. It was none other than Dorothy Hartley, Henrietta's companion, who arrived at the cottage with an expression that suggested she had come on a matter of some urgency and was uncertain whether she was behaving properly in doing so. Miss Marple invited her into the small sitting room, offered her tea, and settled herself back into her knitting with that air of calm acceptance that seemed to immediately put Dorothy at her ease. "I do not know quite how to explain my visit, Miss Marple," Dorothy began hesitantly, turning her handbag over and over in her lap in a gesture of nervous tension. "It is only that Miss Ashford has been in a most unusual state since yesterday afternoon. She has barely eaten, she spent the entire evening in her study with the door closed, and this morning she asked me to research something rather unusual. She wanted to know whether I could discover the address of a woman named Sarah Mitchell, someone who apparently left the village some years ago. I managed to find an address in London, a boarding house in Kensington, if you can believe it, and Miss Ashford seemed quite satisfied with the information, though she provided no explanation for why she wanted it." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded Dorothy with an expression of sympathetic understanding. "You are concerned about Miss Ashford's well-being," she said, phrasing it not as a question but as a simple statement of fact. "Tell me, did Miss Ashford employ a secretary named Sarah Mitchell? I seem to recall hearing some mention of a young woman who left her employment rather suddenly some months ago." Dorothy's face went very still. "How did you know that?" she whispered, and in that moment it became clear to Miss Marple that Dorothy herself had begun to perceive that the various threads of mystery that surrounded Henrietta's recent behavior might be converging toward something of considerable significance, though what that convergence might ultimately reveal remained, for the moment, veiled in uncertainty. Miss Marple did not answer Dorothy's question directly. Instead, she set aside her knitting with deliberate care and rose from her chair with that particular slowness that comes not from infirmity, but from a desire to gather one's thoughts with appropriate gravity. She moved to the small sideboard where she kept a decanter of sherry, poured 2 glasses with economical precision, and handed one to Dorothy before settling herself back into her chair with an expression of quiet attentiveness. The gesture itself was significant. Miss Marple rarely offered sherry to visitors, reserving such courtesies for occasions when a conversation was likely to venture into matters of considerable delicacy or emotional weight. "I did not know precisely," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice carrying that particular quality of thoughtfulness that suggested she was constructing her explanation with careful attention to accuracy. "Rather, I had begun to assemble various pieces of information that seemed to point in a particular direction. Mrs. Webb, who manages the post office, had mentioned that you had dismissed a young secretary some months ago under circumstances that were never adequately explained. When combined with the sudden appearance of a mysterious locket bearing only a date, and the information that Miss Ashford had been requesting a sedative to aid her sleep, it seemed reasonable to hypothesize that the 2 events might be connected in some fashion. But you must understand, Dorothy, that I am merely an old woman who has spent a great many years observing the patterns of human behavior. I claim no special knowledge, only perhaps a certain facility for noticing what others overlook." Dorothy sipped her sherry with the air of someone who needed its fortifying properties, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the glass. "You are quite right, of course," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah Mitchell was Miss Ashford's secretary. She came to us about 18 months ago, a lovely young woman, well-educated, from a respectable family that had fallen into reduced circumstances. Miss Ashford seemed quite taken with her at first, but then something changed. I do not know precisely what occurred, but one day there was a terrible argument in Miss Ashford's study. I could hear raised voices, though not the specific words being spoken. When it was over, Sarah was dismissed immediately, given a month's wages, and told to leave the house by the end of the week. Miss Ashford would not discuss it, would not explain anything, and she made it quite clear that the subject was not to be mentioned again. And yet, Miss Marple observed gently, the subject is now being revisited, albeit in a manner that suggests Miss Ashford wishes to do so privately, without drawing attention to her actions. The locket, bearing the date 1952, would suggest that something of significance occurred in that particular year. Tell me, Dorothy, was Sarah Mitchell born in 1952? Or does that date represent something else entirely? Dorothy's face had gone quite pale. She set down her sherry glass with a small clink that seemed to echo through the quiet sitting room. Sarah was born in 1953, she said slowly. But there was something else. Something that I did not understand at the time, and that Miss Ashford certainly never explained. When Sarah was dismissed, I was clearing out her desk. She had asked me to send her personal items to her mother's address in London, and I found a letter, addressed to Miss Ashford, that had been torn to pieces and placed in the wastepaper basket. The pieces were small, but I managed to reconstruct enough to understand that it contained something quite significant. There was a reference to the truth that cannot remain hidden, and something about the locket that proves everything. I did not know what it meant, and I confess I was rather frightened by the implications. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her fingers resuming their work with the knitting needles, in a gesture that seemed to help her organize her thoughts. "It appears," she said thoughtfully, "that Miss Ashford has been confronted with something from her past, something that she had perhaps believed to be safely buried or forgotten. The appearance of the locket suggests that someone, whether Sarah Mitchell herself or someone acting on her behalf, has deliberately chosen to remind Miss Ashford of a matter that she would apparently prefer to remain undisturbed. The question that presents itself now becomes not merely what occurred in 1952, but rather why someone felt compelled to resurrect those memories at this particular moment in time." Dorothy stood abruptly, her composure beginning to fracture under the weight of whatever realization was beginning to form in her mind. "Miss Marple, you do not think that Miss Ashford did something to Sarah, do you? You do not think that this mysterious locket is some sort of threat or warning? I have known Henrietta for 12 years, and while she is certainly a woman of considerable pride and formidable standards, I cannot imagine her doing anything truly harmful to another person. I think," Miss Marple replied with careful precision, "that we must be very cautious about drawing conclusions without adequate evidence. However, I do believe that your concerns regarding Miss Ashford's well-being are not without merit. It might be advisable to keep a careful eye on her over the coming days, and to note any unusual visitors or communications that might occur. The nature of this mystery will likely reveal itself through such channels, and it would be well to ensure that we have observed carefully when the revelation arrives." She paused, regarding Dorothy with an expression of sympathetic understanding. "I would also suggest that you consider whether there are any other details about Sarah Mitchell's departure that might have seemed insignificant at the time, but which might now appear in a different light." Dorothy departed Miss Marple's cottage approximately an hour later, her demeanor substantially altered by the conversation that had transpired between them. She moved with a new purposefulness, as though the act of articulating her concerns aloud had transformed vague unease into something more concrete and actionable. Miss Marple watched from her window as Dorothy's motorcar disappeared down the lane toward Ashford House, and then she settled herself once more into her chair with her knitting, though her needles moved with considerably less regularity than they had previously. The patterns she was creating seemed almost unconscious, automatic gestures, while her mind engaged with the various threads of the mystery that were beginning to present themselves. Over the following 3 days, the village of St. Giles continued its ordinary operations with that peculiar surface normality that masks whatever undercurrents of tension or disruption might be flowing beneath. The summer weather remained reliably pleasant. The shops opened and closed at their appointed hours, and the residents conducted their daily business with the comfortable familiarity of people engaged in the rhythms of a life that had remained largely unchanged for generations. Yet to those possessed of sufficiently keen observational faculties, and there were, it should be noted, several such individuals scattered throughout the village, subtle alterations in the ordinary patterns had become apparent. Henrietta Ashford, normally a figure of prominence at the various social gatherings that punctuated village life, had largely withdrawn from public view. She did not attend the Women's Institute meeting on Tuesday afternoon, which represented a deviation from her attendance for the past 8 years. She did not appear at the vicar's garden party on Wednesday morning, an absence that occasioned considerable comment, given that she had contributed substantially to the refreshments. Most significantly, she had engaged a private motor car to transport her to the railway station on Thursday morning, an action that had not gone unobserved by various interested parties. Miss Marple became aware of these developments through the ordinary channels by which village information circulated, though she supplemented her knowledge with a degree of deliberate observation that went somewhat beyond the merely passive reception of gossip. On Thursday afternoon, approximately 2 hours after Henrietta's departure toward the railway station, she found herself in conversation with the young porter at the station, a boy of perhaps 18 years who was delighted to provide information about which train Miss Ashford had boarded, the London Express, departing at 11:30, with connections to Victoria Station. Miss Marple received this information with an air of casual interest that betrayed nothing of the significance she attached to it, and subsequently made her way to the post office, where she found Mrs. Constance Webb engaged in the ordinary work of sorting the afternoon mail. "I wonder," Miss Marple remarked casually, as though the thought had merely occurred to her in passing, "whether Miss Ashford has mentioned her travel plans to anyone in the village. It seems rather unusual for her to depart so suddenly without informing the vicar or other members of her various committees about her absence. One would think that a woman of her organizational habits would have provided some explanation for her sudden journey." Constance looked up from her sorting with an expression that suggested she had been anticipating precisely this inquiry. "As a matter of fact," she said, "Dorothy Hartley came in this morning with a note for the vicar, informing him that Miss Ashford had been called to London on a matter of some urgency and would be absent for several days." The note was written in Dorothy's hand rather than Miss Ashford's, which was rather unusual, though I suppose one might attribute that to time constraints or fatigue on Miss Ashford's part. The address in London was not provided, which seems somewhat careless, given that the vicar might need to contact her should some village emergency occur. Miss Marple absorbed this information with her characteristic thoughtfulness, her fingers reaching unconsciously into her knitting bag, as though seeking the comfort of her needles. And the tone of the note? Did Dorothy mention anything about Miss Ashford's state of mind when she wrote it? Whether she seemed troubled or merely businesslike in her communication? Dorothy was rather tight-lipped about the whole matter, Constance admitted, though I did notice that she seemed considerably anxious about something. She kept glancing toward the door as though she was afraid someone might enter, and she asked me specifically whether I had observed anyone unusual about the village in recent days. I told her that there had been one rather interesting visitor, a young woman who arrived on Monday evening and has been staying at the Crown and Anchor. Nobody seems to know who she is, though my sister's daughter mentioned that she rather resembles the young secretary who was dismissed from Ashford House some months ago. A silence fell between the two women, the significance of this revelation settling over them with palpable weight. Miss Marple's knitting needles had gone very still, and her blue eyes had narrowed in that particular manner that suggested she was assembling various disparate pieces of information into a coherent pattern. "A young woman resembling Sarah Mitchell has returned to the village," she said quietly, more to herself than to Constance. "And within days of her arrival, Miss Ashford receives a mysterious locket bearing the date 1952, becomes sufficiently disturbed to seek medical aid, dismisses her companion's customary presence at social gatherings, and departs suddenly for London without providing an address or adequate explanation for her absence. One might almost say, Mrs. Webb, that the sequence of events suggests a pattern of cause and effect, though the precise nature of that pattern remains somewhat obscured. "Do you think something dreadful has occurred?" Constance asked, her voice dropping to a more confidential register. "Do you think this young woman has come to cause trouble for Miss Ashford?" Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to depart the post office, moving with the deliberate slowness that characterized her movements. "I think," she said carefully, "that we must wait to observe what develops over the coming days." The young woman's presence in the village, combined with Miss Ashford's sudden departure, suggests that some form of confrontation or revelation is imminent. Whether that revelation will prove to be merely a matter of personal distress or something of more serious consequence remains, for the moment, uncertain. However, I confess that I should very much like to make the acquaintance of this mysterious visitor at the Crown and Anchor. One often finds that direct observation proves considerably more illuminating than the transmission of information through intermediaries. The Crown and Anchor public house occupied a position of modest prominence on the village green, a building of indeterminate age that had been substantially renovated during the previous decade and now presented an appearance of respectable cleanliness that did little to disguise its fundamental character as a country inn of the most ordinary description. Miss Marple had frequented the establishment on various occasions. The landlord, Mr. Edward Pritchard, served an adequate cup of tea and maintained a small dining room where one could obtain a simple luncheon, and she was therefore able to present herself there on Friday afternoon with the air of someone engaged in nothing more significant than her customary routine. The lounge was relatively empty at that hour, occupied only by a pair of traveling salesmen absorbed in their newspapers and an elderly gentleman she did not recognize, who seemed to be nursing a glass of bitter ale with considerable dedication. It was the young woman seated near the window, however, who commanded Miss Marple's attention. She was perhaps 25 years of age, with dark hair arranged in a modern style and features that bore certain similarities to descriptions that had been provided regarding Sarah Mitchell, though whether this constituted confirmation or merely coincidence remained open to interpretation. She was dressed with considerable neatness, in a dark dress and jacket that spoke of modest but respectable circumstances, and she was engaged in the occupation of staring out the window with an expression of such profound intensity that she seemed almost oblivious to the ordinary activities of the village beyond the glass. On the table before her sat a cup of tea, apparently untouched, and a small leather journal in which she appeared to have been writing. Miss Marple ordered a pot of tea from the landlord's wife, and settled herself at a table positioned such that she could observe the young woman without appearing to do so. This was a technique she had perfected over many years, the art of observing without seeming to observe, of gathering information while maintaining the appearance of being occupied entirely with her own quiet pursuits. She withdrew her knitting from her bag and settled into the familiar rhythms of her needlework, allowing her hands to work while her mind engaged with the various questions that the presence of this young woman raised. After approximately 10 minutes, during which Miss Marple had completed nearly a quarter of the row she was working, the young woman rose abruptly from her chair, gathered her journal, and departed the lounge with a gesture that suggested sudden decision rather than casual movement. This proved to be the opportunity Miss Marple required. She set aside her knitting with careful deliberation and, allowing a few moments to pass, rose and departed the public house herself. The afternoon was moving toward evening, and the summer light had begun its gradual transition toward the golden quality that precedes dusk. She made her way along the high street with the unhurried gait of someone engaged in an evening constitutional, though her eyes tracked the movements of the young woman ahead with careful attention. The girl proceeded directly toward the church, pausing at the lych gate, with an expression that suggested she was gathering courage for some action she had determined to undertake. She then pushed open the gate and entered the churchyard, disappearing from immediate view among the gravestones that dotted the grounds. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, moving with the caution required by the uneven ground and her advancing years. When she reached the church itself, she positioned herself near the entrance, from which vantage point she could observe without intruding. The young woman was kneeling before a particular grave, her head bowed in what appeared to be either prayer or profound contemplation. Miss Marple, with the assistance of her considerable knowledge of the village's history, was able to discern from a distance the inscription on the headstone. It bore the name Margaret Mitchell, with dates indicating that the woman had passed away some 15 years previously, apparently in her middle years. The young woman remained in this posture for some minutes, her shoulders occasionally trembling in a manner that suggested she was struggling with significant emotion. When the young woman finally rose and turned to depart the churchyard, she became aware of Miss Marple's presence and halted abruptly, her expression shifting from sorrow to something more akin to defensive wariness. For a moment, neither woman moved, and in that suspended instant, a communication seemed to pass between them that went considerably beyond the mere exchange of words. The young woman's eyes were red from weeping, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the leather journal more tightly against her chest. "Good evening," Miss Marple said gently, her voice carrying that particular tone of compassionate understanding that had the effect of causing even wary individuals to lower their defensive barriers. "I do not wish to intrude upon your private grief, but I could not help but notice that you have been visiting Margaret Mitchell's grave. I knew Margaret quite well. Many years ago, she was a woman of considerable character, though her life was marked by certain difficulties that were not always apparent to casual acquaintances." The young woman's composure wavered visibly. "You knew my grandmother?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and in those 5 words, Miss Marple perceived the confirmation of a suspicion that had been forming in her mind since the moment she had learned of the mysterious locket bearing the date 1952. The pieces of the puzzle, which had previously seemed scattered and disconnected, suddenly began to arrange themselves into a pattern of startling clarity. Sarah Mitchell had not departed the village merely because of some personal conflict with Henrietta Ashford. Rather, she had discovered something about her own origins, something that connected her to the past in a manner that Henrietta had apparently spent decades attempting to conceal. The locket, the date of 1952, and the young woman's return to the village were not random events, but rather the culmination of a personal journey undertaken to uncover truths that had been deliberately hidden from scrutiny. Miss Marple suggested that they might benefit from a more private location for their conversation, and the young woman, whose name she confirmed to be indeed Sarah Mitchell, agreed with a degree of reluctance that suggested she was uncertain whether trust was advisable. They proceeded together to Miss Marple's cottage, the evening light fading around them as they walked through the quiet streets of the village, and once settled in the comfortable sitting room with fresh tea before them, Sarah began to articulate the circumstances that had brought her back to St. Giles after her abrupt departure some months previously. Her account was delivered in a hesitant manner, as though she was still uncertain whether she possessed the right to discuss matters that had been kept deliberately secret for so many years. Yet there was also an undertone of determination that suggested she had committed herself to the pursuit of truth, regardless of the consequences. "My mother died 2 years ago," Sarah began, her fingers turning her teacup over and over in a gesture of nervous tension. "She had been ill for some time, and toward the end, when she knew that she was not going to recover, she told me something that changed everything I thought I knew about myself. She told me that I was not actually her daughter, but rather her niece, that I had been raised by her as her own child because my real mother had died in childbirth, and my father had abandoned any claim to me. She gave me the locket before she died, and she told me that it contained the only proof of who I really was. She said that if I ever wanted to know the truth, I should come to St. Giles and seek out a woman named Henrietta Ashford, because she would be able to explain everything. Sarah paused, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the visible world, as though she was still processing the significance of the revelation her mother had imparted. I came to the village to serve as Miss Ashford's secretary because I wanted to observe her, to understand what connection she might have to my past. I thought perhaps she had known my mother, or that she might be a relative I had never known about. But within a few weeks of my employment, I discovered documents in her study, letters, birth certificates, all manner of things that revealed the truth. Henrietta Ashford is my mother. She was unmarried when she became pregnant, and rather than face the scandal that would have resulted from an illegitimate child, she gave me to her sister to raise as her own. She paid for my education, ensured that I was cared for, but she could never acknowledge me publicly. The revelation hung in the air between them, its significance almost palpable in the quiet sitting room. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful deliberation, her mind engaging with the implications of what she was hearing, and how those implications aligned with the various observations she had accumulated over the preceding days. The date on the locket, 1952, suddenly resolved itself into devastating clarity. Henrietta would have been approximately 21 years old in 1952, a young woman in her prime, unmarried and presumably without means to care for an illegitimate child. The social conventions of that era would have made her situation untenable, would have necessitated precisely the sort of desperate solution she had apparently undertaken. "When you discovered this truth," Miss Marple asked gently, "what was your response? How did Miss Ashford react when she realized that you knew?" "I was foolish," Sarah admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I was hurt and angry, and I confronted her directly, demanding explanations and justifications for what she had done. I told her that she had no right to give me away, that she had deprived me of my own identity. She became very upset, and she said things, terrible things, about how she had done the only thing possible, how she had given me a better life than she could have provided, how the sacrifice had been more painful for her than I could possibly understand. But I would not listen. I was too wounded by the discovery to comprehend anything beyond my own betrayal. She dismissed me that very day, and I left the village in considerable distress. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression one of profound attentiveness. "And yet you have returned. The locket appeared at the garden fete, which suggests that Miss Ashford deliberately sent it to you. What do you suppose prompted her to take such an action?" Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I wrote to her after my mother's funeral. I told her that I understood now, that I had come to comprehend the impossible situation she had been in, and that I was not as angry as I had been. I asked her to forgive me for the cruel things I had said. I did not expect a response, but 3 weeks ago I received a letter from her in which she apologized for her harshness, and told me that she had never stopped thinking of me as her daughter, regardless of the circumstances. She sent the locket with a note saying that she wanted to acknowledge me publicly, that she no longer cared what the village might think or say. She asked me to come and stay with her for a time, so that we might attempt to rebuild some sort of relationship. And that is why you have returned to St. Giles," Miss Marple observed, "and why Miss Ashford has departed so suddenly for London. She is preparing to make some form of public declaration regarding the truth of your parentage. She is, in essence, deciding to acknowledge you openly, regardless of the scandal it might occasion." Miss Marple's expression had shifted into something more complex than her habitual composure. There was an element of sadness in it, mixed with something that might have been resignation or perhaps acceptance of the peculiar tragedy that often accompanies human attempts to rectify past mistakes. "Do you think the village will be very shocked?" Sarah asked quietly. Do you think people will condemn her for what she did? The village, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, has always been more forgiving of human weakness than it initially appears. Yes, there will be gossip and surprise, but underneath that initial reaction, there will likely be comprehension. People understand, far better than we often give them credit for, the terrible choices that circumstances sometimes force upon us. Miss Ashford made a difficult decision under impossible circumstances, and she has spent the intervening years attempting to rectify that decision to whatever degree was within her power. That is, I think, a testament to her character rather than a condemnation of it. The conversation between Miss Marple and Sarah extended well into the evening, the darkness settling gradually outside the cottage windows as the older woman listened with patient attention to the younger woman's account of her discoveries and the emotional journey that had culminated in her return to St. Giles. By the time Sarah departed, Miss Marple having insisted that she remain for supper and offering to drive her back to the Crown and Anchor in her small motor car, a sense of resolution had begun to settle over the situation, though it was a resolution of the sort that typically precedes rather than follows significant developments. Miss Marple found herself reflecting, as she prepared for bed that evening, on the curious nature of the human capacity for concealment, and the manner in which truth, once set in motion, seemed to gather momentum until it could no longer be contained by the ordinary structures of discretion and propriety that typically governed village life. The following morning brought the first indication that matters were about to accelerate beyond the careful containment that Miss Marple had thus far observed. Word arrived at the post office, conveyed by telephone from London and subsequently transmitted through the village by the efficient mechanism of Mrs. Constance Webb's communications network, that Henrietta Ashford had suffered a sudden collapse at her hotel and had been admitted to a private nursing home for observation and care. The news occasioned considerable alarm among those who had known Henrietta for decades, and speculation regarding the cause of her illness ranged from the merely medical to the darkly dramatic. Some suggested that she had experienced a stroke, others that she had succumbed to the general weakness that accompanied advancing age, while a third faction hinted at the possibility that her distress had been of a psychological rather than purely physical nature. Dorothy Hartley, who had accompanied Henrietta to London, called the vicar to request his prayers, and offered no additional information regarding the circumstances of her employer's condition. It was Timothy Blackwell who brought news that altered the trajectory of these events in a manner that no one could have anticipated. He appeared at Miss Marple's cottage on Saturday afternoon with an expression of considerable agitation, his usual composure entirely displaced by the urgency of whatever matter had compelled him to seek her out. Miss Marple invited him into the sitting room with her characteristic hospitality, and Timothy proceeded to explain, with considerable difficulty, that he had received a visitor at the chemist's shop that morning, a woman identifying herself as Dr. Margaret Sinclair from a London medical facility, who had requested information about a sedative that had been prescribed for Henrietta Ashford approximately 1 week previously. She seemed very concerned, Timothy explained, his words tumbling over one another in his haste to convey the full significance of the encounter. She said that Miss Ashford had been suffering from considerable stress and that the sedative had been intended to help her sleep. But then she asked me something quite unusual. She asked whether Miss Ashford had displayed any signs of confusion or disorientation when she had collected the prescription. At the time I said no, but thinking back on it, there was something rather odd in her manner. She seemed distracted, almost as though she was not fully present in the moment. Dr. Sinclair also asked whether anyone else in the village had been exhibiting unusual symptoms, whether anyone had complained of headaches or dizziness or general malaise. Miss Marple's expression had become very still, all of her attention focused entirely upon Timothy's words. Did Dr. Sinclair explain why she was asking these particular questions? She inquired, her voice taking on a quality of urgency that was unusual for her. Did she provide any indication of what had prompted her investigation? That is where it becomes quite remarkable, Timothy continued, his agitation increasing. She explained that Henrietta's collapse in London appears to have been caused by some form of poisoning, not a fatal dose, but rather a substance administered in small quantities over an extended period. A slow poison, she called it, something that would accumulate in the system and eventually produce symptoms of acute distress. She suspected that someone had been deliberately poisoning Miss Ashford, and she wanted to determine whether the poison might have been introduced into the sedative medication itself or whether it had been administered through some other means. The implications of this revelation hung suspended in the afternoon light, transforming everything that Miss Marple had previously understood about the situation into something far more sinister and deliberate. What had appeared to be a matter of personal reconciliation and the unveiling of long-buried family secrets had suddenly revealed itself to be something considerably darker, a crime that had been perpetrated with calculated intention and meticulous planning. The mystery that had begun with a mysterious locket at a garden fete had evolved through layers of emotional revelation into something that now demanded not merely understanding of human motivation, but also investigation into deliberate criminal action. "We must inform the police immediately," Miss Marple said with uncharacteristic firmness, rising from her chair with a determination that belied her years. "Though I confess that before we do so, there are several matters that require clarification. Tell me, Timothy, was there anything unusual about the manner in which the prescription was collected? Did anyone else have access to the medication? Was the bottle sealed in any manner that would have prevented tampering?" Timothy's face had gone quite pale. "I did not think to examine these matters carefully at the time. It was simply a routine prescription for a regular customer. The bottle was sealed with the ordinary label, indicating the contents and dosage instructions. But now that you mention it, I do recall that when Miss Ashford collected the medication, she seemed less interested in the instructions than one might have expected. And there was another matter. Dorothy Hartley called the shop several days later to inquire about the medication's effects and whether there might be any unusual side effects if it were to be combined with other substances. I thought it a curious question at the time, but I assumed she was simply being cautious regarding Miss Ashford's health." Miss Marple moved to her window, staring out into the village green with an expression of profound concentration. The pieces of the puzzle, which had seemed to arrange themselves into a coherent pattern regarding Sarah Mitchell and Henrietta's long-concealed maternal relationship, suddenly demanded reassembly into an entirely different configuration. Someone in the village had deliberately attempted to poison Henrietta Ashford, and the motivation for that attempted murder required investigation far more careful than Miss Marple's previous observations had encompassed. The arrival of Inspector James Hartwell from the county police force transformed the quiet village of St. Giles into something resembling an active crime scene, though the inspector himself seemed determined to conduct his investigation with a discretion that would minimize disruption to the ordinary rhythms of village life. He was a man of approximately 50 years, with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent considerable time outdoors, and the measured demeanor that suggested long experience with human nature in its more complicated manifestations. He established himself at the vicar's house, which offered suitable privacy for interviews, and began the meticulous process of gathering statements from those who had been in contact with Henrietta Ashford during the period preceding her collapse. Miss Marple, having been identified by both Timothy and the local constable as the individual most likely to possess relevant observations regarding village affairs, found herself summoned for an extended conversation with the inspector on Sunday morning. Inspector Hartwell listened with careful attention as Miss Marple outlined the sequence of events that had begun with the mysterious locket at the Garden 50, proceeding through her discovery of Sarah Mitchell's identity and the revelation of Henrietta's long-concealed motherhood. She spoke with her characteristic precision, offering observations rather than conclusions, allowing the inspector to draw his own inferences while providing him with the framework upon which those inferences might be constructed. What she did not immediately disclose was the hypothesis that had been forming in her mind during the preceding hours, a hypothesis that required considerably more evidence before it could be presented as anything more than conjecture. The poisoning, Miss Marple observed thoughtfully, appears to have commenced approximately 3 weeks before the garden fete, based on the timeline you have provided. That would place the initial introduction of the substance at approximately the same time that Henrietta received Sarah's letter of reconciliation. One might theorize that the poisoning was not undertaken in response to Sarah's return to the village, but rather was initiated prior to any anticipation of that return. This suggests that the perpetrator was motivated by something else entirely, something that existed independently of the family situation that has been the focus of our recent investigation. Inspector Hartwell leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You are suggesting that we have been looking at this matter from an incorrect perspective? That the poisoning was not undertaken by someone seeking revenge for Henrietta's treatment of Sarah Mitchell? I am suggesting, Miss Marple replied carefully, that we must consider the possibility that multiple matters have been occurring simultaneously, and that our natural inclination to connect apparently related events may have led us astray. The locket and Sarah's return represent one thread of narrative, but the attempted poisoning represents quite another thread entirely. The question that presents itself is whether those two threads are truly intertwined, or whether they merely appear to be so due to the proximity of their occurrence in time. By Monday afternoon, Inspector Hartwell had interviewed nearly every resident of the village of sufficient age and proximity to Henrietta to have had opportunity to introduce poison into her medication or food. Dorothy Hartley had been questioned extensively regarding her access to the sedative and her unusual inquiry about combining it with other substances. Sarah Mitchell had been asked to account for her movements during the period of the poisoning, though her recent arrival in the village seemed to eliminate her as a suspect. Various neighbors, friends, and acquaintances had submitted to questioning with varying degrees of reluctance and cooperation. Yet despite these efforts, no clear culprit had emerged, and Inspector Hartwell seemed increasingly frustrated by the absence of concrete evidence pointing to any particular individual. It was Miss Marple who requested a private meeting with the inspector on Tuesday morning, and it was in that meeting that she articulated the conclusion toward which her observations had been gradually directing her. She explained, with meticulous care, the various details that had caught her attention, and the manner in which those details suggested a narrative quite different from the one that had initially presented itself. She spoke of Dorothy Hartley's devotion to Henrietta, extending across 12 years of service, a devotion that might have masked considerably deeper emotions. She mentioned the curious fact that Dorothy had inquired specifically about the sedative's interactions with other substances, suggesting knowledge of pharmacological matters that would be unusual for a mere companion. Most significantly, she outlined a series of observations regarding Dorothy's behavior during the preceding weeks, her increasing anxiety, her peculiar reactions to various developments, and most tellingly, her response when Miss Marple had suggested that Henrietta intended to publicly acknowledge Sarah as her daughter. Dorothy Hartley, Miss Marple explained quietly, has constructed her entire life around Henrietta Ashford. She is not merely an employee, but rather a woman whose identity has become entirely dependent upon her position in Henrietta's household and her role in Henrietta's life. When Henrietta announced her intention to acknowledge Sarah, Dorothy perceived that acknowledgement as a fundamental threat to her own place, her own significance. Sarah would become what Dorothy could never be, a legitimate claim on Henrietta's affection and attention. The poisoning was not undertaken as an act of malice toward Henrietta, but rather as a desperate attempt to ensure that Henrietta would become increasingly dependent upon Dorothy's care and attention. A woman requiring constant nursing would have no opportunity to develop new relationships, no capacity to acknowledge illegitimate daughters. The poison was a mechanism of control, administered with the calculation of someone who had convinced herself that she was acting in Henrietta's best interest. Inspector Hartwell absorbed this analysis with the expression of someone witnessing the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. When Dorothy Hartley was subsequently confronted with Miss Marple's observations and the evidence that supported them, she confessed within the hour, her confession pouring forth in a torrent of words that revealed the desperation and fear that had motivated her actions. She had not intended to kill Henrietta, she insisted, only to ensure that she would not be abandoned, that she would not be rendered obsolete by the arrival of a newly acknowledged daughter. By Wednesday, the case had been resolved, and Inspector Hartwell prepared to depart St. Giles with his suspect, and the weight of yet another crime solved through the intervention of an elderly woman whose observations of human nature proved far more valuable than conventional investigation.